had the great opportunity to develop the whole southern face of the block of Gansevoort Street, from Washington Street to Greenwich Street, luckily owned by the same person. So one client came to us with the challenge to propose additional bulk to the southern face of that block. At the end of the day, we were able to add 80,000 square feet, more than 80,000 square feet to what was there, which is a great accomplishment and great approval, a challenging approval at Landmarks.
This is a special project for me for a lot of reasons. I think at BKSK we like to practice in many scales, but it's not often that you can say that in one project. And I think what was so enjoyable about this was we were kind of operating at the scale of urban design and architecture and finely crafted details. I was always struck by the fact that we were grappling with essentially 11 buildings over 3 zoning lots, stretching an entire city block. It's not often that architects have the opportunity to do that. And it was really enjoyable to kind of dig into the history of each of these buildings.
Almost every project in a landmark district is a once-in-a-lifetime project. So I always remember when I talk about this project to people that I walk down the High Line until you get to the southern end of the High Line. And at that southern end, you look out over this block. The fact that the High Line terminates there and that the High Line has become such a huge public amenity, such a part of living in New York City, I felt the weight of responsibility. The texture and the history in the most granular form, one could really see this as a response to that varied history. One of the aha moments very quickly was we found a 1938 photo that showed this block. Demolition had begun during the Great Depression. The western end of the block was 5-story tenement buildings. The middle of the block was of varied heights because of demolition. And the shot was evocatively taken from under, not the High Line, which was a later elevated railway, but from the elevated railway on the eastern end of the block, which in fact was Manhattan's first elevated railway. So this block is uniquely bracketed by elevated railway on the east end that began that type of construction, that phenomenon of that mode of shipping and delivery and transportation of people in Manhattan. And then on the western end, kind of the last gasp of the shipping of commercial goods by railway. That this block between the railway lines, we had the opportunity to continue its evolution. So we took that opportunity.
The history and development of the Gansevoort Market Historic District in Lower Manhattan is super fascinating. It developed over 4 significant periods of time, as opposed to other districts that have maybe 1. And we were able to pick and choose, in a way, from those 4 moments in time. We spent a lot of time studying with photographic records, the historic photographs, to establish the height of the buildings in the 1800s. So what we were proposing ultimately was no taller than what had been there in the 1800s. And it was really fun to find all these historic photographs. And that was what was really fascinating about what we found, was kind of the remnants of what had happened really in the 1930s. So the corner building, starting from the east, 46 to 50, Gansevoort, had been replaced in the 1940s. It was a tall 6-story tenement building, and it had become a 2-story market building marking the corner. And that one was the most intact. The next building to the west, its taller tenement building had been replaced also in the 1940s as kind of a mini-me of that corner market building. What we found was a wood-clad club building. So we took the wood cladding off. So as you can see, the 2 corner buildings have similar colored light creamy brick restored to their 1940s design. What you don't realize when you look at it is everything that's happening inside those buildings now. The corner building we rebuilt, kept its new skylight that had been installed in the 1970s, restored it, high energy efficient skylight, which floods the interior of that building. So the second building, which is 50 Gansevoort Street, was restored to its 1940 style. And behind its facade, however, is a brand new building. So what we did was install skylight right behind the facade to flood The interior space is a two-story space. It's a sense of arrival to a little new market building. And the second story is then built above the pre-existing roof line, but invisible from the street. In the center of the block is 52 to 58 Gansevoort Street, also known as the Market Building. And that was a really fascinating assembly of three pre-existing buildings. So in the 1800s, they were 4- and 5-story buildings that in 1934 were cut down in the Depression, but assembled as a beautiful little composition. The center building, as you can see, is a little taller. They left the parapet a little taller than the two flanking buildings and created a nice little symmetrical assembly. So what we learned about the next building was really interesting. In the 1800s, it was a series of 5-story tenements, but about 6 years after the market building had been cut down, it too got chopped. It would be appropriate to propose restoring that bulk, that street wall, and there was this great chimney scar on the eastern facing lot line of that building that you could see in the 1938 historic photo. We incorporated it into our proposal as a series of brick tiles hung on cables in front of fire-rated glass. And we also incorporated that same technique into the transoms of the windows of our design to be more contemporary floor-to-ceiling glass, yet be disguised from the street to be more the tenement size fenestration pattern. Last but not least, on the corner of Washington Street, we looked more towards the district-wide characteristic of large-scale warehouses.
There were just so many great examples of, these heroic, bold, strong masonry buildings that had, beautifully crafted and detailed facades. And there were just countless versions of those buildings that we learned from and drew inspiration from when we were looking at the design. In particular, 60 to 74 Gansevoort Street, we really looked at a brick system that had a lot of depth and carefully detailed window surrounds to really bring back some of that historic character of many of the adjacent buildings. I think it's a really interesting neighborhood as a kind of an example or a template for other historic districts across the country about how you can intervene in something that's historic, still honor it, and propose some bold contemporary architecture that can stand alongside of it. That's something I think is particularly special to this neighborhood.